What's going on, everyone? Mike here in the BFH garage. It's back on the rack, and I'll tell you what, if you recall a trail video that I did recently on Chinaman Gulch, as I'm coming down the trail, my drive shaft was banging into the side of the body of this thing, which leads me to believe that my transmission mount is broken. Now, one of the things I've had on my list that I've just not done yet is to build a cross member to support that transmission instead of using the traditional thicker transmission mount that goes to the belly skid. A couple reasons I want to do that. Number one is that I want to try to lower the backside of that transmission. So the front of the engine is going to stay where it's at, and if I can lower the back end, that's going to reduce my drive line angle from my transfer case to my rear axle. That's been killing me lately. The other reason I want to do it is with the transfer case transmission being mounted to the belly skid, every time I bend my belly skid up, it raises everything back up and it creates that driveline angle issue again. And I would drive home from the trails with severe vibrations due to the angle being off. So my goal today, or over the next couple days, is to get this cross member built that's going to support the transmission, keep it separate from the belly skid, and then I can take off the belly skid if I want to do maintenance without having to worry about supporting the transmission, because the cross member will do that for me. So I need to get the belly skid off, I need to get the engine skid off, get everything supported, and I'm going to take a look and investigate. Let's go. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to support the transmission right here, and I'm going to remove these four nuts right here, which is the transmission mount. Then I'm going to drop the skid plate there. So once I get that down, I can kind of get a better idea of what's going on. So let's take a peek and see if we can figure it out. Okay, looking at my transmission mount, it is not moving like I thought it was going to. So I believe that it may not be broken, and that's okay. But I got to figure out why my drive shaft over here was banging up against the side of the tub. So there is a chance that when I put my skid plate on last time that the transmission moved this way just a little bit, and I just need to push it back that way to get it back in line. And that's fine and dandy, because I'm still going to build the cross member, but I'm going to make sure that I have the engine in line with the transmission, everything where I want it, before I burn anything into place. So this is still coming out, but it's surprising. I actually thought I was going to have a problem there that I don't. Now, for those of you that are not familiar with the 241 transfer case to the 231 transfer case, the 241 being the transfer case that's used in a Rubicon, when you do that swap into a non-Rubicon Jeep such as mine, you have to add these spacers in here in order to make it work. I believe they're right about 1 inch. It's been so many years since I've done this, I forgot, but it's right about that 1 inch mark. So that's why those are there. So I'm going to go ahead and undo all these. I'm going to pull this mount off, take a closer look at it, and then after that I'm going to take out the exhaust. So as I'm taking everything apart, when I go to put this cross member back in, things I need to be aware of. I have all these lines over here that I'm going to have to push up and out of the way. I'm going to have a catalytic converter here. I haven't decided if I'm going to delete this or not, since it's a dedicated trail rig now. But I have all these things I got to think about. So as I take out my exhaust, I need to think about where these things are going to go as I start to put all this together. So something to keep in mind. Okay, I'm back out here on the project again, and what I want to do is I just want to kind of recap where I am so far. So the first thing I wanted to do is get the Jeep up on the lift, get the transmission supported, get the exhaust out, and get my skid plate off. That allows me full access to everything. I got some pipe in there, started to take some measurements and kind of seeing how things were going to fit. And the thing I like about this particular job is that it's kind of like a thinking man's game. You gotta just put parts in place and see and imagine where they're going to go and where they're gonna fit and how you wanna mock this up in order to make it the best possible outcome at the end. So I've done a lot of that, and a lot of this stuff has just been me sitting there staring at it and thinking about it and kind of holding parts up. So now that I have the majority of that stuff done, I'm gonna walk you through underneath the Jeep with the camera to understand what my thought process is and help you better understand what you can do for yours. Now, the one thing I do wanna clarify, there are other aftermarket options for Crossmembers out here. I know Genrite makes one, I mentioned TMR earlier, and those are fine options if you wanna spend that money. But if you want to save a little bit of money and learn how to do these projects yourself, then by all means, jump right in. You just got to buy yourself some steel, have a welder, and use your brain up there to figure some of this stuff out. So come on under and let's take a look. Before I show you what I'm dealing with underneath the Jeep, let's take a look at this and see if we can conceptualize what it is that I'm trying to do. This is a thinking man's game to figure out how all this stuff works together and to make sure that we don't have any interference issues. So the crossmember that I'm going to do, very similar to the TMR crossmember. In fact, if you wanted to do a TMR crossmember, you could. The reason I choose not to is that TMR uses polyurethane bushings, and I want to use rubber bushings, which matches my motor mount. And then that will reduce vibrations, or at least keep them to an absolute minimum. So the way the TMR works and the way most any other crossmember works is you're going to have a short section of pipe that goes over a different section of pipe. So you can see how it telescopes. It's like a slip fit. It's tight. There's no wiggle room in there whatsoever. And the stuff I am using is 1.5 inch outside diameter DOM, 1.5 inch inside diameter, and then what I'm going to do is put rubber bushings on the outside. I sourced my rubber bushings from JK control arms. So if you look here, you can see where the control arm used to go there. I've already ground it down a little bit. I've already taken the other control arms and I've taken the barrels and I've already got those all cleaned up and ready to go. The bushings here are in great shape. This JK did not have a lot of miles, so I know that my bushings are good, and I also already have replacement bushings should those wear out relatively fast. So that's my goal, is to use that, or that's what I'm going to do. It's not a goal, so it's going to happen. And anyway, what this does, this gives me the opportunity. So what I'll do is I will take my DOM, I'll cut it in half, I'll take out a certain amount of room in between. But what it allows me to do is to cope my ends like this, and this is just a test run on the cope. Put your barrel there, weld that while tacking in place to get everything fit up, but you'll eventually weld that in place. And the whole reason behind the cope, the whole reason behind the slip fit is that I can do one side, get this barrel tacked in place, and if I need to make any adjustments, I could turn it inside the barrel, and then the other one I could do the same thing, and I could spin them against each other, make sure that they're squared up to each other so we're not in a bind. And these things, they'll be working the way they should. So that is the way that that goes. This now will attach underneath the transmission. I'm going to make a plate that goes over, attaches to the bottom of the transmission, and that plate welds there. Then the slip joints or the DOM could slide in. I could adjust them where I need it, get my tabs mocked up, get everything where I need it, tack it all in place, make sure everything is good. Then I could burn it in place and everything will be good. Now, when you look at a TJ transmission mount, this is the one I pulled off my Jeep here. It goes like this, and you could see how it takes up a whole lot of real estate. And my goal is to try to lower the transmission and the transfer case enough that I can get a little bit better driveline angles. Because right now, if I wanted to go to longer shocks in the back, I'd have to put a limiting strap on there. And I probably would have to do that anyway, but what I'm trying to do is reduce the angle of my drive shaft in order to minimize vibrations that come from there. I want it to be as easy as possible on those U-joints. So my plan, I have an extra one of these laying around the shop. My plan is to use this. I'll cut it off, I'll cut this part off, and I'll re-weld this for when I go to put my exhaust back on. I'll figure out a way to do that. But this will give me a good starting point. So what I'll do is I'll take this off. I'll get the new one. As you can see, I already cut it down. There's nothing special about that. I just cut it down so I can kind of play around and get a feel for how this is going to work. Again, this is not my transmission mount here. The transmission mount goes over here somewhere. Now actually it goes upside down like this on the original. And as I showed you in the previous video, when you're using a 241 transfer case, which is the 4-to-1 low, and you made it up to a non-Rubicon skid plate transmission mount, then you have to make these little spacers. And I believe these spacers are about an inch thick. I'm sorry, they're 3/4 of an inch. But anyway, they had to fit right here to space it out so that way everything could rest. Now this doesn't matter anymore because I'm making my own custom Crossmember. So I take this out of here. Now I'm going to put this one here, but instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to cut it back here somewhere, and then what I'll end up doing is I will end up cutting this kind of in that circular pattern there, if you can see that, and then this will mount back here, but it'll be further in this way. And if you can see how you get the curve of the pipe that goes there, this will kind of tuck in. The thing that I got to be careful of is you see how close those bolt holes are. If I get any further than that, then they may give me some issues. So these are the types of things that I'm going to have to figure out how it's going to work. Can I do it from back here and be a little bit more successful? Probably, but what happens then is that pushes this mount backwards. Now this reinforcement rib becomes my problem. This becomes my problem. Just from looking at it, I'm anticipating that I'm going to have to cut out this rib, and I'm going to have to cut out this transfer case portion where it mounts. So these are the things that we got to look at and figure out how it's all going to play together and how it will fit up without interference. One other thing I want to mention is my skid plate, when I pulled it off, was not flat. It was bowed up like this. So I took this big old flat square pipe, set it across the rib, and it bowed off on both sides. So what I did is I took my press over to the press. I took my skid plate over to the press, and I flattened it out about as good as I'm going to be able to get it. I don't have to get it completely flat because nothing's going to be touching it, but I want to make sure I give myself the most amount of room that I can have. So things like that you need to keep in mind when you are building this. Now, one last point before we move over under the Jeep, and that is if I put this bar across here and I measure down, I have 1.5 inches of room to work with as far as dropping that. Only have 1.5 inches. So what I did, the thing I have to account for is on these bushings here, there's going to be some torque and some vibration that allow these to flex a little bit. So I built in a 1/4 inch spacer up from the bottom of the skid, because if the skid gets bent again, it can come up 1/4 inch and it's still not going to touch anything. But I want to build that in there for a little bit of wiggle room in case there's movement on those bushings as things torque a little bit. So I want to make sure I account for that. You'll see what I'm talking about when we get over here to the Jeep. All right, so as we come underneath the Jeep here, this is where the transmission mount lines up. First thing I do before I do anything else is I took tape measure, measured to the ground, wrote it up here, so that way if there's any confusion or I need to reset and get back to where I started, I have that measurement already there. So part of my plan is to lower the entire transmission, the drivetrain, so that way I can reduce the angle of my drive shaft at the output there. I don't need to drop it much, but I definitely want to take advantage of being able to drop it down a little bit, so that way my drive shaft isn't rough on the U-joints there. Now I don't have a Savvy skid, I have a Rockman skid, so I can work within the confines of that, and I think I'll be all right. So the sleeve, the slip sleeve that's going to go around the 1-inch pipe that goes across, I need to figure out where I need to put this, both forward and back, as well as up, down, and where the plate that goes on top there is going to attach and how it's going to attach to this pipe. So there's a whole lot of variables there, and if you come sideways, you'll see what I'm talking about as well. I can move it forward, backwards, and I can even move it up into this notch. And that, if I do that, if I move it up into the notch, it allows me to drop the entire drivetrain a little bit more, and like I said, allows me to get that drop for my drive shaft. So I'm going to start messing around with some measurements, get some things figured out. One of the things you need to be aware of is that over here on this frame rail, you have all of your brake lines, your fuel line. I have my ARB line run over there, so we're going to have to relocate that stuff. Over on this side, you're going to have to figure out how you're going to get around your exhaust. So your exhaust will have to be reworked as well. And these are all things you need to take into consideration as you are building this. The very first thing I want to do is get my skid plate back on with my transmission mount removed. What that does, that gives me an idea of how much room I'm going to have to work with. So as you look under there, you can see there's a pretty big gap with that transmission mount out of there, and that is nice. So if you come over to this side here, you can really kind of get a look that I can drop that transfer case by quite a bit. In fact, my first point of interference is right here. And I measured that at exactly 1.5 inches. And so if I drop the transfer case 1.25 inches, then that gives me that happy spot that I'm looking for, that keeps it protected, at the same time lowers that output shaft, which reduces that drive shaft angle. Now, with all of that being said, this right here would come right into the back of the skid, so I'll probably have to notch this out a little bit in order to drop it where I want. So I'm gonna have to take a close look at that and see if I want to drop that much, or if I'll be happy to get the 1/2 inch out of it, and we can call it good at that point. So got a lot of head scratching to do, start to figure this out, and then I'll start putting pieces together and test fitting. So another thing I noticed right off the bat too is that to get my cross member in, you remember I have this rib right along through there. Let me see if we can do it from this side. And if I get this pipe in there, is my cross member mount, right there is on top of the rib, as you can see. So I can shorten the length of that pipe so it fits down in that notch, but I'm probably going to have to remove the actual old transfer case mount. But I can also take this and raise it up like I was talking about. And then we're looking at probably about a 3/4 inch that we can drop without issue. So again, all these things you got to start paying attention to as you're doing this. And also understand that as I do that, I realize that I'm going to have to cut that rib out, because if I drop it 3/4 inch, that's just enough to put it on the rib. And I don't want to be hitting that thing at all. So I'll probably end up removing that and putting a separate one across from it, or behind it, or in forward of it, just to reinforce the plate a little bit, and see if I can't strengthen it that way. But where it's at right now is directly in the way of where I want the cross member to go. So I'm gonna have to get creative with this to make it work. I think I can do it, and it's time to start cutting some things up and test fitting. With the transmission mount and that rib moved off of the skid here, now you can really see how much room I have to work with. So that frees up a whole lot of space, no doubt about that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the transmission down, see where my first point of interference is, back it up by about 1/4 inch. I'm going to call that good. I've lowered the transmission, and my first point of contact is what I thought it was going to be. this piece right here. So that's, you know, a little less than a finger there. That's about 1/4 of an inch, which should give me plenty of safety margin for that. I'm gonna probably box this in and plate it to reinforce that again. But looking over here, you can kind of see the other things I'm talking about. Ton of room there that I can work with now, and I'm pretty happy so far. So now I know that I can drop the skid plate back off, start working on the cross member, and then we'll get it dialed in. Okay, as I move into this, I have that extra transmission mount mounted up there to give me an idea of where I can place stuff. So my goal, I cut off a little sliver of that tube. This gives me an idea looking at it. Can I move it forward? Can I move it backwards? Where is it going to be optimum for me to get this thing in there? And playing around with it, you know, I could raise the transmission back up, which I don't want to do because I just gained 1.25 inches of transmission droop to reduce that rear tail shaft. So I want to find a happy medium somewhere in here. Now the question is, how do I do that? Well, I have a 1-inch bar that I'm going to put across the frame rail here, and it's going to give me an idea of how much room I'm going to have to play around with. You remember, I have up to 1.5 inches. I subtract that 1/4 inch, that gives me 1.25 inches to play with. So if I use the 1-inch bar and mark my line from there, it will show me what I can get. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Okay, I have my 1-inch bar right here, but I can use up to 1.25 inches. So if you look closely at the gap right here, it's hard to get my camera up there, but that gap is just about 1.25 inches. So I could safely assume that that is going to be my line right there that I can use. Now, looking down the line at my transmission mount, I could put a line here, and that lets me know I don't want to move any further that way. So I have my mark there, and I have my mark here. I'm going to square them up, and I'm going to take my tube, and I'm going to put it up there, and I'll trace around, I'll scribe around it, and that will be my mark on where I want to put that slip tube. So I'm going to start with that. If that doesn't work, luckily I have an extra transmission mount, but let's see how this thing goes. So I tacked up the slip joint and the transmission mount to see what I'd have, and on the skid you saw the clearance there, about 1/4 of an inch. The problem is that skid's kind of bent, and on that far side it gets really close to it. The other thing I don't like is when you look down here, see, we get that just right there. You see how I don't have a whole lot of room between the slip joint pipe and the transmission mount. I need to get a weld in there to make sure that thing's not going anywhere. So what I was hoping with, as far as this factory transmission mount working, is not going to work for my needs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this pipe and kind of move it up at that angle just a little bit, so it moves it away this way and brings it up just a little bit, and I'm going to get a little bit more meat on the pipe itself, and that'll allow me to get a good weld on there, and I don't have to worry about it failing if I land on a rock and it gets a pretty good jar to it or something like that. So I'm going to have to create a new mount, and I'll do that next. So the original factory mount that I was going to use isn't going to work, as this mounts up to the transmission. I'm not going to have enough room to put a weld in there, and if I did, it would be a very thin weld, and I don't want to do that. I want to make sure I get plenty of meat to hold everything in place. So I'm going to pop this thing off, and I'm going to use a different plate for a mount. As you can see, it's about 3/4 of an inch longer that way. That'll give me everything I need. And I decided to keep it the same width, maybe just a little bit shorter. That way, when I weld, I get welds beyond the bolt hole there, and I make sure that that entire area is plenty strong and not cracking on one side or the other. So I'm going to have to transfer the bolt pattern over to this, and then I have some other 3/16 stock here. I did a little test cut on a cope. What I'll do is I'll bring those in from the side, and I'll kind of box this in a little bit like that, and I get welds on both sides. Probably going to be way overkill for what I need, but it's the last thing I want to be thinking about on the trail if I'm bashing into rock and my skid bends up and hits the cross member again. I don't want to have to worry about that at all. So, yeah, that's that. I finished up making my new transmission mount plate. This is the old one. And as you can see here, it fit great, but the problem is if I put a weld bead right along here, then the actual transmission itself is too close to this, and that weld bead would interfere with the fitment of this. So this is not going to work for my likings. So I have a new plate here, and I could either use the wide side. As you can see, this hole's way back compared to the old version. That gives me a lot of room, or I can turn this around, and I'm still back at least 1/4 of an inch, which will give me a good weld bead and allow it to fit. So I'm not sure which side I'm going to use first. Things I need to take into consideration is this thing is mounted here. If I push it back further, then it could affect how the exhaust goes in. So I want to keep everything as tight as I can, even though I have the room to kind of put it wherever I want. So if I keep it as tight as I can, then anything else I do along the way, it's already going to be packaged tightly and nothing else will be in the way, or at least it'll be as tight as it can get. And if it's in the way, then there's nothing else I would be able to do about it anyway. So I want to get this mounted up underneath the transmission, put this on there with my DOM, get a feel for how everything's going to go, tack it, put the plate up, see how much room I have. So here's what I have going on so far. I took my new transmission mount plate, it's 1/4 inch thick. You can use 3/16. I had a small piece of 1/4 inch, so I just decided to use that since that was my best scrap laying around. I have a 1 inch square tube here that gives me 1.25 inch drop. That's the max I can go. In other words, if I take my slip sleeve here and I roll it down, I can't be any lower than the bottom of that square tube. So with the room I have, I could actually roll this thing up a little bit and make sure that I stay way above that. So that's actually really good for me. That'll allow me to get that tube up just a little bit higher, so that way I don't have to worry about that skid plate denting and then making contact with the cross member. So what I need to do now is make sure this is perfectly level across the frame rails and then get it tacked in place. Then I'm going to put the skid up, check fitment. So I have a couple tack welds in there. In the slip joint, I have my DOM in there. I measured both sides from the frame rail, exactly 1 1/8 on both sides. So that tells me that it's nice and perpendicular to the frame rails. So now I'm going to throw up the skid plate and see what kind of clearance I have on the bottom side here. But I got to grind the rest of that stuff out of the skid plate first. I am dying to see how close this is going to be. This is going to be awesome. Moving along now, skid plate is in place. You can see that I have probably 3/8 of an inch underneath this side. And the same over here, although when you look right there at the slip joint, I don't have a lot of room where that flashlight shine. I have maybe 1/4 of an inch, and I thought that would be good. I think I'm going to opt to raise this another 1/4 of an inch because I have the room still for the muffler and all that. So I put that up there and double checked everything. I'm going to raise it just so I don't get those vibrations of the skid plate onto the transmission mount if I end up bending my skid plate. So I'm going to bring it up 1/4 inch and then we're going to be good. After having moved that around a little bit, I feel a lot more comfortable with it now. You can see the gap I have under there and the gap I have under there. We're looking at about 1/2 inch. So for me, that makes me feel a lot better because I do ding this skid plate up pretty good, and I think it would easily bend up that 1/4 inch, and it kind of made me nervous about making contact with the cross member and getting vibrations through the skid plate. So I'm going to tack that slip joint to the actual transmission mount pretty good. I'm not going to fully weld it in yet because I want to do a whole bunch of other test fitting before I commit to doing all of this. Then after I get that set, the next step is to cut that DOM tube in half, notch the outside for the barrels so I can get those tacked in place and see how I'm going to fit it up against the frame rail. So a little more work to do still. Now it's time for me to cope out the DOM to accept the barrel here. I want this barrel offset to where it's raised up on one side. So the flat side of this bar goes right along the bottom of that. So I want it to be down there similar to that. So I have to set my pipe up in here the right way. So I already have my jig all set up. And the other thing I want to do is I want to do half of the diameter of my hole saw. That way I have plenty of meat to weld onto. So get my measure up here. Get it right exactly where I want it. Tighten that down, we're good to go. Measure twice, cut once. Get some cutting oil on there. Once that's done, pull it out, put it up for a test fit. You can see how tight that cope is. Sure, some of you are wondering how tight this cope is on this. So with that hole saw in the drill press, you can see that this thing gets just perfectly tight. So that is good. Now, before you tack weld anything in place, make sure you clean up all that steel down to shiny metal. You don't want any of that mill scale on there still. You can sit on top of the barrel like that, or before I'll do that, I'll take my straight edge and I'll put it right here. Then I'll take my DOM, put it on there and make sure that I am square to that. And after I get this measured out and everything perfect, I'll tack it in place. Then I'll put it back up into the Jeep to see exactly how far into the slip tube this needs to go. One of the things you need to understand when you weld is that the steel will want to move, so it could easily get off center on this. So I want to double check that before I weld that other side. And if I need to straighten it out, I can, and in this case, I do. Just a little bit. With that tacked in place now, you can see how I got my profile along here perfect. Now I could slide it into the slip joint, and when I put it up underneath the transmission, I can move this around any which way to square it up, and I can move in and out to get exactly where I need it to be before I burn it in place. Time to do the other side. I have everything tacked in place where I want it now. So now what I need to do is figure out the relationship between all of this. So I take this one, put it in that side, this one, put it in this side. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this up underneath the transmission. I'm going to have these in place, put up the skid plate, figure out exactly where this needs to go this way and how far out or in these need to go this way, because it's going to be raised up, so it's going to give me a little bit more room to work with. And once I get that exactly where I want it, I'll make sure these two ends are square to each other. I'll tack it in place and then do another full test run to make sure everything is good. Once that's done, I can start working on the frame side brackets that'll come up. But right now, I just want to get this thing where I need it and go from there. I have the skid plate back out now. While I was under here with the skid plate up, I adjusted this arm as far out as I wanted to get. I have about 7/8 of an inch before I hit the side of the skid. I have about 7/8 of an inch on that side, and those are just random numbers, so whatever works for you is going to work for you, but that's what I decided to go with so I don't have any interference issues. The next thing I need to do is make sure that the barrels were square to the frame, and I want them consistent on both sides. So I want them square to the frame. So I just take a little square up here, a little framing square, put it right next to the barrel, and you can see how that is square on that side, and same thing on this side. So right after that, what I did is I marked the arm there on both sides. That way I know how far it goes in, and there's two marks there. There's another one that's in closer because I had to move it out. And then I'll mark a lateral line so that we know exactly where to put those when I take them out. So I'm going to pull them out for right now, kind of look at everything once over, make sure all my measurements are good, and then I'm going to start burning this stuff in. So I have both barrels fully welded in. And I made sure I line up my lines, and then if you look, you can see how that barrel's completely flat on the table. That barrel's completely flat on the table, so they're true to each other. The one thing I still need to do is to burn in the actual plate. So I got my pieces cut for the lateral support here. Just need to get those tacked in place. I'm going to burn those in. Then I'm ready to burn in these. Everything else looks good, so we're on the tail end of getting this part of it done. And then we will move on to the brackets that actually bolt to the bushings and get those up to the frame. Okay, the cross member section is complete. I've got everything burned in where it needs to be. Barrels are done, plug welds are done. This thing should be plenty strong enough for what I need. In fact, probably overkill, but I definitely don't want to worry about it. So now that we have that done, we need to figure out how to get our brackets from the frame rail to these. So I need to press, well actually I need to paint this first. I'm going to press the bushings back in. I have the cross member all painted up. It is completely done with the exception of pressing in the bushings. So that's coming up next. I'm going to throw a little bit of grease on there, get those pressed in. The only other thing that I want to do that I haven't figured out yet, because I need to get it up and installed first, is the exhaust hanger. So on the original transmission skid, this is welded to that, and that is what is used to help hang that exhaust. So once I get this completely installed, get the tabs welded in, then I can come back, figure out how I'm going to set this as an exhaust hanger. And you know what, I struggle sometimes trying to get the exhaust out when you have to pull it a certain way to get that hanger out of the hole here. So what I'm considering doing is putting drilling a hole through there and putting a tab that I can bolt through, and then have this welded to the tab, so when it comes time to take off the exhaust, I can undo the belt or the bolt, just pull that out, then I can work the exhaust where I need it. So let's go get those bushings pressed in, and we'll go from there. After getting the cross member completely primed and painted, I went ahead and pressed in the bushings. And now what I need to do is figure out the tabs from here to here. It's not a straight, simple across. I have to do it up at a slight angle. So I made all these tabs the same. I'm gonna put a template in here, maybe cardboard or something, run it over there to see what that's gonna look like. I'll trace it to the tabs that I already have pre-made from scrap laying around the shop, and then I can see where that's going to go, get it all cleaned up, bolt it together, tack weld it in place, come back, burn it in, and that should do it for the cross member. So I took my tabs, I traced them onto cardboard, so I'm going to cut these out. I already have one cut out, and the purpose of this is I can get my angles on the frame rail correct, and I can transfer them to the cardboard, put my angle where it needs to be, make sure that is going to fit inside the bushing, and then I can transfer that back to the steel and cut the steel there, and then kind of clean it up as I go. You know, if it needs to be a little more taken off, I can just take a flap disc to it and get it down relatively easily. I have the brackets all made and bolted in. They're not tack welded or anything yet. I'm just doing test fits here, but you can see how all that goes. Now, I want to tell you, this wasn't as easy as I thought it was going to be, as far as just making some cardboard cutouts. As you can see down there, I had multiple variations of everything that had to happen. And the thing that I didn't take into account for is that even though I made the barrels parallel to the frame rail goes off at an angle on both sides. So over here, it's going to go off at this angle, and that changes things. So I had to sit there and think through it. The one thing I wanted to make sure was that my bottom tabs were on the same line on the bottom of the frame rail. And what that means is they get a little bit off on the upside. So this one here is a little bit steeper that way. This one goes a little more that way, but everything lines up like it should. Same thing over here. Bottom of the tabs are right above the frame rail, just right above it. And then when you look above, you can see the back one's slightly higher than the other one. And that's fine because it's on that angle. And as you do that, angles are going to change. So that's what ended up happening there. So what I did is I snugged the bolts up. I didn't crank them down because, you know, once you weld it and then you paint, you still need a little bit of room there. And just before I forget here, let's say that I weld this in place, I get the cross member back out, and then paint it, and then the cross member doesn't want to go in. You can take a crescent wrench on these tabs and kind of bend them out so that way you can get that cross member back in there. So I'm going to get these tacked in place, or actually I'm going to get the outsides welded is what I'm going to do. I'm going to tack them in place first, get all this stuff welded, drop the cross member, and then get everything painted. And that should do it for the cross member, with the exception of one thing, and that is I still have to figure out where to run these brake lines, fuel lines, my ARB line, and things like that. So my thought on that is to put a tab here that extends up and allow the tab here to pop into that tab. And I know I'm saying tab a lot here. In my mind, it's clear as mud. As I get to it, you guys will see, and hopefully things aren't out of the way too much. So we'll see how that goes. Once you get it welded in place, verify that your welds are good. No porosity or anything like that. I know that one's hard to see. But you want to make sure that you got good penetration to both sides, the frame rail and the tab. And then at this point, I can take the cross member out, let things cool down, get it primed and painted, and then I'll start working on the fuel and brake line tab. So to reroute the fuel and my air lines, my brake lines, I made these little angle brackets. I drilled a 1/4 inch. I'm just going to do a little plug weld right into there. And then, as you can see here, this is the bracket that holds all of the lines. That will stuff right in through the top, and then I'll just run the lines right even with the frame rail. So you'll see what that'll look like once I get this plugged in. So I have everything all painted up now. Hopefully this, no pun intended, paints a better picture of what I was trying to do with the routing of all of those lines. So I made those 90-degree tabs, and I just ran them right along on the top side of the frame rail, as you can see right there, and that keeps it out of the way of the cross member, so I shouldn't have any problems with that. I'll keep an eye on that, and if things seem like they're not working out or wiggling loose or getting any kind of chafing, then I'll revisit it, but I think I'm going to be good. Okay, that wraps it up for the cross member. Now, I've got everything welded. All my joints are welded, barrels welded, my tabs are welded, my lines have been rerun. But it doesn't mean I'm done with what I need to do with the Jeep now. The cross member is only one component of this. So if you recall, I was able to drop the transmission transfer case combination an 1.25 inches. So that's huge, and that changes my driveline angles quite a bit. So what I need to do now is get my exhaust reworked out through the back, and then get this thing down on the ground, and then readjust my pinion angle, because that's going to be a lot different. So if I drive down the road without adjusting it, I'll get vibrations, and then that'll be a problem. So I'll get this all dialed in, so that'd be pinion angles front and back. I'm suspecting the front won't be needing much, if any, adjustment, but the back definitely will. So that's what I have for that. I hope you enjoyed the video. Exhaust comes next. We'll get this thing back on the road, finally.